As I think most of you know, I'm Paul Rinn. I'm the chairman of the awards committee. And tonight's program, I think, will gain a great deal of interest for you, and I think we'll all learn quite a bit about the events of the day. Cuban Missile Crisis. It was simply a seminal event for the Kennedy administration. History offers really no parallel. In the 13 days in October in 1962, when the United States and the Soviet Union paused on the precipice of nuclear war. A simple estimate basically says that never before, and hopefully never again, there will be that high of a probability of so many people in the world suddenly being killed. Estimates are 100 million Americans, 100 million Russians, and countless millions Europeans who would be killed in the fallout and the explosions that would have taken place. National calamities and inhumanities in the history of the world would have paled and faded into insignificance had this event taken place. So why did the Russians chance it when they had been warned? And why did we react as we did and establish a quarantine? What was it like out there to be on station in the quarantine, and how did those at sea feel about it all? How were the boardings conducted? What was the plan? How much did we know? How well were we prepared? And what were the crews of the quarantine ships feeling? We have with us tonight three distinguished speakers who have a unique insight into the events and have the ability to answer some of those questions. They are Dr. John Schlesinger, a policy expert that the Kennedy White House thought highly enough that they asked him to come to the White House in Washington, D.C. to help advise them on how to deal with the Russians in this incredibly tricky event. Captain Cal Calhoun commanded Destroyer Squadron 6, who was in charge of the ships that went alongside to do the boardings. And OSC George O'Malley, who was on the signal bridge of the Joseph P. Kennedy and watched the boardings take place. They will all give us their firsthand insight into what happened on those days. But I think it's important for all of us who walk around with cell phones and in this day and age of instant communications to really understand the world that existed in 1961 in that time frame. And I want to put you in the proper frame of mind after a day like today. And so you can remember, some of you can remember, and some of you weren't born. And no, I was not there and I was not on active duty. But you need to learn what the world was like back then. So in order to set the stage, I'm going to give you some information. Economics. The price of a barrel of crude oil was $16. The price of a gallon of gasoline was 19 cents, and you could buy it at 13 on some retail places. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was 691. The average household value, not including the home, was $2,400 for an average American. The median salary of middle-class America was $4,800. That's a year, by the way. When I told that to my daughter, she said, "You mean a month, right?" No, a year. In Rogers, Arkansas, Joe Walton opened a place called Walmart. Kresge's started Kmart, and yes, Target was open too that year. The average refrigerator in the United States was 8.5 cubic feet, but only 68% of the households in the United States had refrigerators. TVs were black and white, 16-inch max, and they were console, not portable. Radios were mostly, if not all, AM. Families had 0.5 cars, go figure. But there was no AC, and there were no seatbelts. A coast-to-coast call cost you $5 a minute, and you called an operator, and you waited for 20 minutes until she got back with you to give you a line. And it was a line because it was a cable that went from East Coast to West Coast. And oh, by the way, for those of you in New York, you were on party lines, and frequently you listened to Mary Bell talk to her girlfriend on the phone. We launched Telstar that year, and it played music that was heard for the first time on the West Coast and in Europe. And as a matter of fact, that song became #1 on the hit list, and Dick Clark played it on his show. Socially, the news commentators, Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, Howard K. Smith, Eric Sevareid, and Lowell Thomas. The American Civil Rights Movement was just coming to life, and Selma, Jackson, Mississippi, and Little Rock, Arkansas were big time in the headlines. Kennedy founded the first committee on women's rights in the United States and asked a woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt to chair it. The Beatles released Love Me Do, and Rolling Stones debuted as a lead-in for some unknown rock singer in a tiny club in the basement of a rock band headquarters in London. And a guy by the name of Bob Dylan hitchhiked from Madison, Wisconsin, that right-wing university, to New York City's Greenwich Village to meet a guy by the name of Arlo Guthrie so they could conspire on a song called Alice's Restaurant. And Johnny Carson started on The Tonight Show. Dr. No was in the movies, and the United States launched 8 satellites that year with names like Mariner, Ranger, and Telstar. John Glenn, Scott Carpenter orbited the Earth. And John F. Kennedy went to Rice University to tell the world in the United States that we would go to the moon by the end of the decade. And the Washington Post chastised him and said, unrealistic, unreal, and unattainable. President Kennedy then went to Dulles Airport and dedicated it, and the Washington Post said, why in the world would anybody build an airport that far out from DC area? If you think air flight was safe, that year there were 8 air disasters that killed almost 2,000 people in the skies over Europe and the United States. Sports. Will Chamberlain scored 100 points against the New York Knicks. Not much has changed. Roger Maris hit 61 home runs. And the Los Angeles Dodgers played their first game at Chavez Ravine for the franchise that was one of the richest, if not the richest, in baseball. Some things do change. Political. Berlin was a gigantic burr in the Soviet saddle. Why? 3.5 million Germans had defected through Berlin to the Western world. The Russians persistently pressed the US and the UK to leave and backed it up with 28 armored divisions in Eastern Europe. NATO had 7. The standoff at Checkpoint Charlie were frequent, and in the middle of the year, 12 Soviet tanks and 12 Sherman tanks stood head-to-head with loaded guns pointed at each other in one of the famous standoffs at Checkpoint Charlie. The Germans then and the Russians decided to build a Berlin Wall, and they called it the Fascist Repulse Barrier in an attempt to cut Berlin off from the rest of the world. The United States embargoed Cuba, and 18 nations, and the Cuban Military Tribunal convicted 1,179 Bay of Pigs invaders to a life sentence. 18 nations became free of their colonial masters. Great Britain, Portugal, Belgium, France, and Spain gave them up. Algeria and Congo were the 2 leading ones to be noted. Gary Powers was exchanged for Rudolph Abel, a Russian spy. And US conducted, just for emphasis, its last atmospheric nuclear test by exploding Small Boy over the Nevada desert. And at a cocktail party in Washington, D.C., a French diplomat who was sleeping with a woman who was also sleeping with a Russian diplomat noted to an American, you guys need to check on what the Russians are doing in Cuba. There's something going on there. In mid-September, a U-2 pilot flew over Cuba in one of the many spots noted there. When he came back, his pictures were evaluated by the intelligence branch, and they noted places where there were baseball fields now had soccer fields. And when the intelligence expert looked at that, they said, something's not right. And they sent another U-2 flight out to see what they could find. Militarily, We just sent 18,000 military advisors and 200 helicopters to Vietnam to take care of a problem that we thought we could take care of in about 18 months. The names in Southeast Asia were Diem, Suvarnabhumi, Suvarnabhumi, and Prince Sihanouk. And Mrs. Kennedy was planning on going to see Angkor Wat and visit Prince Sihanouk. The Navy had 1,400 ships and 348 destroyers. I'll say that again. The Navy had 1,400 ships. We had one ship permanently stationed in the Middle East, a seaplane tender called a Valcor in Bahrain, at HMS Ufair, and we sent over 2 Gearing-class destroyers during the year on an unaccompanied and unattached deployment to kind of tour around the Middle East. The service chiefs were at odds with each other over the national strategy, and frankly, weren't talking. Mr. Kennedy was still stinging from the Bay of Pigs advice he had gotten and wasn't necessarily listening. The CNO, Admiral Anderson, and Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, quite frankly, didn't like each other. On the waterfront, maintenance dollars were down and readiness was a struggle. The officer corps in the Navy was very much World War II and Korea War tested and had some very strong opinions about the Russians. Interestingly enough, the Russians had the same opinions about us. And a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev conferred to one of his ambassadors, Mikoyan, I don't know if I can stop those guys if the ball starts rolling. Communications, frequently not timely. We all remember missing numbers at 8 o'clock reports. Yep. And comm stays were the key to long-term communications, and as this event unfolds, NAVCOM stay Rota, Norva, Monrovia, and Balboa became incredibly critical places to get timely communications. A system of alert orders, warning orders, and deployment orders that we have today did not exist. A task group of Marines had just left the Med, 30,000 strong, and were heading west to the United States, and they were at sea, fully ready. The 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne were getting ready for their annual exercise, fully armed, fully ready. 26 warships were at sea, and the Navy was kicking off Springboard, which put another 26 at sea. There were 5 fleet oilers and AORs at sea, fully loaded and ready for operations. Strategic Air Command had 9 bombers in the sky, all with nuclear weapons. Polaris submarines were on patrol. The world was turning, and the clock was ticking. And on 10 October, in the morning cabinet meeting in the White House, Mr. McNamara turned to President Kennedy and said, Mr. President, we have something important to show you. The U-2 pilot who had flown over Cuba had something that was different than soccer fields. Tonight, we'll learn what was revealed, and we'll learn a little bit more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope you enjoy the program. Dr. Schlesinger.
I never believed, ladies and gentlemen, that I would see a day like this. Because I go back to the sinking of the Bismarck back in 1939, when I was a little kid of 12. And already then I was cheering for the US Navy. And here I am, how many years later? You can figure that one out yourself, okay? And here I am actually addressing the United States Navy. To me, this is a miracle. And I'm so grateful to conferring on me what I consider practically a miracle. I think you can surmise from this that I'm a Holocaust survivor of the Nazis, because I grew up in Europe. They kicked me out of Austria, Czechoslovakia, went via Siberia to China, and from there, by a converted troop transporter controlled by the US Navy, reached San Francisco in 1947, and there promptly kissed the ground because my knees gave way when I saw the Golden Gate Bridge, the great symbol of freedom. So that's how this story starts. I also went to a Midwestern college, then, to my own surprise, was admitted to Harvard University, and at Harvard met the gentleman who was responsible for my presence here today. His name was Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who was my favorite history professor. And he called me one day and said, "John, I have to tell you something. You won the Bancroft Prize for the best book written in 1962 on international relations, and you will get the prize from Columbia University." And at first I didn't believe him, because having been a Holocaust survivor, my self-esteem was very limited then. I was a guy who was only 35 years old, and I couldn't believe that I would be chosen by Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. to have something to do with the now known Cuban Missile Crisis. But my friend Arthur said, "We would like you to come down to Washington, D.C. There's something very strange going on here, and we would like to appoint you as a resource to President Kennedy and his cabinet, and you'll be just in time if you take the Metroliner down from New York and get off at D.C. Okay? Is there still a Metroliner running? Who knows? Okay, all right. So I took that train down and arrived just in time for being introduced to the members of President Kennedy's cabinet. But the most amazing thing was that I was told I should look through a one-way glass which I could look into directly what was going on in the Oval Office. I could see them, but they couldn't see me. They couldn't see me. So that's how this thing started and how I got this job. Now, President Kennedy introduced me to other members of his cabinet. At that point, they were in process of constituting themselves as a special committee of the cabinet, and they called themselves the XCom. So these few people, about 12 of them, were known as the XCom. Now, let me give you the names of that committee, which is important, obviously. The members of the XCom were the President, his brother Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, Defense Secretary, Maxwell Taylor, representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John McCone, head of CIA, Adlai Stevenson, who was ambassador to the United Nations, where he made that famous speech saying, "Hell will freeze over before I leave here, before you admit," that is to Valerian Zorin, the representative of the Soviet Union, "till you admit that you have secret missiles in Cuba." And John F. Kennedy was rather pleased with Adlai Stevenson for having done that, even though Adlai Stevenson had run for the presidency, which he lost not once but twice. And then there was McGeorge Bundy, who was National Security Advisor to the President, who also had just given up his job as Dean of the Harvard Graduate School, which many of us cheered because he wasn't particularly popular there. Also, there was Theodore Sorensen, who was speechwriter for the President on occasion, and then Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who of course was one of the advisors to the president and also became his chronicler, the historian who wrote that beautiful book, 1,000 Days, which is the number of days that the president served as the President of the United States. So, let's talk about a minute about these overflights and the soccer fields. What was little known was that the Russians were already building these missile stations, that the person who flew over, that they were half completed in 2 different places in Cuba, San Diego de los Baños and San Cristobal. They were half completed. And so people had to theorize how long it would take for the missile stations to be completed so they can fire missiles at the United States. After all, Cuba was only 90 miles away from Florida. It would not be all that difficult. And this is how the XCom began its job. The president was just at the beginning of a briefing to his cabinet. He spoke for about, I would say, 20 minutes, and then paused and asked for questions. But to my absolute amazement, there were no questions. Instead, the XCom began to swear like a bunch of truck drivers. They began to vent and swear. They were outraged at the impertinence of the Soviet leader Khrushchev, who was having the nerve to do what he was doing, and they couldn't stop swearing. So what I will do here is to tell you what President Kennedy did to stop the swearing. He said, "Gentlemen, I sense there are 4 or 5 possible solutions that I see to this crisis if we really look at it more closely." And then he went to a chalkboard, which they generously offered to me, but I don't feel like going down the stairs. So because I consider it a waste of time, precious time, so I will describe it from here in ascending order of importance. He drew the line diagonally, a straight line diagonally, from bottom to top. Mine would have been a bit on the shaky side. So let me give you those possibilities that President Kennedy opened for them. Possibility 1, let's do nothing. That was dead on arrival. There was not a single person on the ExCom who would have agreed to doing nothing. Possibility 2, let's go to the United Nations Security Council. Dead on arrival too, because the Soviet Union had the veto power on the Security Council. If they say "niet," it would have been "niet," and the resolution would have failed. Number 3, let someone who has been an espionage agent in Cuba blows his or her cover and approach President Fidel Castro and ask him to ask Khrushchev to take the missiles home. That also failed because Castro did not agree to anything. Now I have to interject here an interesting observation, which I have a citation for, which happened 30 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a friend of Arthur Schlesinger's, who had died by then, who was a reporter, wrote an article in the New York Times on October 22, 1992, and there he reports that Fidel Castro wrote a telegram to Khrushchev and demanded that Khrushchev atom bomb the United States. And Khrushchev said no. In other words, the real bad guy was not Khrushchev, it was Castro. In defense of this request, or shall I rather say in that demand, he said, the Cuban people will sacrifice themselves for the sake of the world communist revolution. How about that one? So, we owe a lot to this reporter. Now, possibility 4. Are we at 4 now? A naval blockade of Cuba. Meaning that the United States will throw a ring around Cuba that no Soviet ships would be permitted to pass. No, but I know now about the US Navy, this would have been ridiculous. I don't think that they could have stopped them. So the next item on that list was what they thought was the safe thing to do, to send some B-52s over Cuba and bomb the hell out of the missiles. The missile stations. Just get rid of them. And then came number 6, which was an invasion of Cuba, the thing that the mercenaries had done in the Bay of Pigs. And then, if I can be frank with you, there was a very interesting person from the Air Force, Curtis LeMay. How many have heard of Curtis LeMay? Curtis LeMay was 6'6" with a basso voice, and he simply said one sentence: "Nuke the commie bastards." Well, after 20 minutes of discussion, Alternative 7, Curtis LeMay's, was rejected out of politeness and said as unwarranted, but also possibilities 1 through 3 were eliminated, which meant the real discussion took place over possibilities 4 and 5. The blockade or the bombing of the missile sites. And here an interesting thing took place. President Kennedy, at that point, said he would leave for 24 hours and go sailing on his ship, his small ship, at Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Now, I was a guy who was 35 years old, and I didn't understand how the President of the United States would leave with the world trembling on the precipice of a nuclear war to go sailing in Hyannisport. And then it sort of came to me. that this man wanted to not only think it through, but also feel it through. He wanted to be close to his feelings. This was the man that Kennedy was. He simply, when he wanted to think something through carefully, he would go sailing. That was his way of doing things when he was worried and really wanted to get things right. So ever since then, I have great respect for the president. The greatest respect indeed. Now, as he had promised, the president returned 24 hours later and announced that he had the beginnings of a solution. And when he was asked what that beginning was, he said, "I've decided to begin with a blockade. But I will call it a quarantine. It's a more neutral term than a blockade." Why do we begin with a blockade? Because there is a huge difference between a blockade and an airstrike at the missiles. The difference is that we might get away without casualties, without people dying. While with the airstrike, there would have to be no escape from people dying. And that is important to me. I don't want to risk any lives unnecessarily. So I must confess here that being the young man I was of 35, and I didn't choose my exclamation that carefully, and something came out that I couldn't take back. I think it was something like, if you forgive the expression, like "holy shit," you know. So that is what happened then. Now, President Kennedy, however, also did one other thing, which I found astonishing. He was a new president, and he oversaw what happened at the Bay of Pigs when he hired several thousand mercenaries in hopes of surprising Castro and forcing Castro, therefore, to quit, to give up, and no longer even to put up a fight. But then, when the president thought it over, he said something most interesting. He said, "How could I have been so stupid?" How many have known this? He could have been so stupid. Now, when you get closer to this, he actually regretted that he authorized this action. It actually came from the previous administration of President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who had arranged this. And the president really didn't want to be seen as someone who was a spoiler. So he wanted to set things right, that not too many lives were lost. He also had not heard anything from his adversary, Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, by the way, sent him a letter that very day, which made a difference to Kennedy. It was a rather interesting letter. He wrote the president the following, and I sort of quote it verbatim. He said, Mr. President, we have tied a knot in the middle of a rope, and there's no way of disentangling it without serious damage to us both. You see, Khrushchev was impressed by Kennedy, who was so careful not to lose Russian lives, after all. And Kennedy, in turn, was impressed by Khrushchev for sending this telegram. I might have added white telegrams, because in those days there was no email, nor were there any faxes. But they did use Western Union, amazingly enough. So now, President Kennedy decides to go public. Mind you, so far, this was a completely secret undertaking. He decided he had to go public to reassure Khrushchev that he meant what he said, no more and no less. So he gave this extraordinary speech on the 22nd of October, in which he made that famous, which is only the other one is more important, the ask not speech. Ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. This was the second most important speech, which went like this. Any missile fired from Cuba at the United States will entail a retaliatory strike, not against Cuba, but against the Soviet Union. Check to the king. And the king was Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev now sends a second telegram. In the first telegram, he had offered that he would be satisfied with an apology and a no-invasion pledge. In the second telegram, which he sent before President Kennedy was even to respond to the first, he raised the ante. He said, let's exchange missiles. Cuba for Turkey and Turkey for Cuba. In other words, I'll take my missiles home, Khrushchev said in his telegram, if you take your missiles home from Turkey, which bordered, of course, as all of you know, on the Soviet Union. And this was a secret annex which the president was ready to honor, but only 4 months later. And unfortunately, as all of you know, 4 months later, he was involved in his re-election campaign, but of course, a year later, he had been shot. So that never happened. So now, we get to the interesting part that was mentioned earlier in the audience about Major Rudolph Anderson. The way I remember it was that President Kennedy was just briefing his cabinet again when an aide walked in. And the aide whispered something into President Kennedy's ear, so nobody else would hear it. And the president visibly went pale. I was even to see that through my little peephole in the one-way glass, through the one-way glass. He went pale. And he said to the ExCom, we have had a casualty. Major Rudolph Anderson has been killed by a Soviet ground-to-air missile. The plane has disintegrated, and the major, of course, has died. Now, at this point, the committee did the same thing that they did earlier. They began to vent, but much worse this time. Much worse. The casualty was not to be forgiven. Lyndon Johnson almost physically charged toward the president as if he was going to hit him. And he said to him, "Hit him, Mr. President. Kill him. Hit him." And the rest of the committee did, the rest of the ExCom did the same thing. And the president was cool as a cucumber. He said, "Everyone sit down." And all of a sudden, I saw this man who was very tall, President John F. Kennedy, stand up straight and said, "No one will hit any buttons or push any buttons or give any authorizations. Under the American Constitution, I'm your commander-in-chief, and I'm there for the man who gives the commands here. I'm in charge of this. And now everybody sit down, because I'm going to absent myself for a few minutes and see what I can do to resolve this matter without a catastrophe." And he left for an hour, President Kennedy. Now, I have to give you a clue here, because very few people know this. The fact that Nikita Khrushchev had been in the United States before, in 1959, right? Does anyone remember this here? He had been invited by an agri-farmer in, of all places, Iowa, where I went to college. All places, Iowa. And there was inspecting hybrid corn. You might say, what, hybrid corn? Well, in those days, hybrid corn was in the experimental stage. And Khrushchev was toying with the idea of buying huge amounts of experimental corn in order to plant it in his own country. So Kennedy was encouraged by this, because what he now reckoned was that Khrushchev, at least in this instance, if not before when he was banging his shoe, as many of you will remember, and getting pissed off at Kennedy and lecturing him in Vienna so that Kennedy couldn't get a word in edgewise. But this time, for once, he really paid attention and decided to plant hybrid corn in Russia for the Russian people, so they wouldn't be starving. And from this, the president was impressed. Again with Khrushchev. So we have this fascinating situation here that neither of these two men could tell the other, do as I say or I will kill you, but both had to say, do as I say or I shall kill us both, which was a very different matter. Or if you will say it otherwise, if everybody is somebody, nobody is anybody. Now, so now both of them had only a short way to go toward an agreement. And that was rather easy to fix, because President Kennedy sent another telegram asking for a personal meeting between himself and the Russian leader, which happened. And then there was this thing that was called a Black Saturday, because the American people, even though now they knew just about everything, they didn't quite know everything. So people on Black Saturday were deathly afraid, and many of them tried to leave, leaving everything behind them. And already then, FEMA, which was virtually useless, was even more useless now. And FEMA said, nobody should evacuate. So of course people evacuated. Whoever listened to FEMA before, right? So, but after all, in the end, all went well. And thank God it did, ladies and gentlemen. Thank God it did. Now, just let me appeal to your imagination. What do you think would have happened if Joseph Stalin had been there instead of Nikita Khrushchev? It would have taken only a few years. Or if, on the American side, Lyndon Johnson would have been there. Lyndon Johnson, who lost, as we know from the Vietnam Memorial, almost 40,000 precious American lives in a useless war in Vietnam. So, there you have it. Now, Arthur Schlesinger, my former history professor, wrote a wonderful book called 1,000 Days, in which he was the chronicler of the Kennedy administration. He was the real historian, not me. It's a wonderful book. And he ends it with the following words. We escaped oblivion by a whisker, quote unquote. We escaped oblivion by a whisker, which is pretty much what my friend Paul Rinn stated far more thoroughly than I did. Now, I will do something here that was not announced nor expected by you, ladies and gentlemen. In my days, before I had to run away from the Holocaust, I was a student of music and studied the great Austrian composers like Schubert, Mozart, Beethoven. And there is something about Beethoven that has always been close to my heart. And he wrote a wonderful piece of music, which I believe in. It's about peace and brotherhood. Peace and brotherhood, which I pray for in my daily life. He wrote the Ninth Symphony, which had a chorale in it. It's called the Ode to Joy. How many of you have heard it here? That's wonderful, because I want you to help me out. Because I'll sing it for you. Please don't faint. I'll sing it for you right from here. And I'll sing it for you twice, because the second time, those of you who know the tune, please join me in it. So here goes. The chorale from Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which I'll sing to you in German because it was written that way. Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt. Everybody. Not yet through. Everybody. Little higher pitch, just for the heck of it. Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain. That was great.
Thank you.
And now Captain Cal Calhoun will give us the viewpoint from a squadron commander's vantage point in the Caribbean off of Cuba.
Thank you, Paul. First, I want to say that I'm privileged to have the opportunity to speak to this distinguished audience, and I'll get on with the problem without delay. I should explain at the outset that I make no claim to be an expert on the subject of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a huge undertaking involving the entire Second Fleet, and my part in it was a minor one. So what you will hear from me this evening will be a bird's eye view of one segment of the total picture. So let me set the stage. I took command of Desron 6 in Genoa, Italy, in late November of 1961. We finished the last 4 months of a Med deployment, spent a month or two in Guantanamo for springboard training, and in October of '62, we were in our home port of Charleston in various stages of upkeep and maintenance. The 20th of October 1962 fell on a Saturday. I had gone to my flagship, the USS Vsol, DDR 878, that morning to be on hand for the commanding officer's weekly inspection. After Dick White, the present skipper of the VSOL, had finished his inspection, I authorized liberty for the cruise of Desron 6. I then returned to my quarters on the Charleston Naval Base. The time was about 11 o'clock, and I had only been in the house a few minutes when the phone rang. It was Captain Harry Allendorfer calling me from Norfolk. He was on the staff of Admiral Dennison, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Atlantic Fleet, and he wanted to tell me that Admiral Dennison wanted to know how many ships of Destroyer Squadron 6 could get underway on short notice. I told him that 4 could sail within the hour, and that the others could go in a matter of a few days. He replied that I should sail 2 immediately, and that orders would be issued for the other 2 to depart the following day. So apparently only 4 Destroyer Squadron 6 ships were required. I asked if we should attempt to retrieve our Liberty parties. He said not to do so, since it would arouse public interest in what was going on. He assured me that Sinkland Fleet would round them up and return them to their ships as soon as practicable. I asked him about our destination, and I was told that we would receive dispatch orders after our departure. I said, well, Harry, I think you better tell me which way to turn after we clear the sea buoy. North or south? He said south. And I said, okay, we're on the way. I was certain that we were headed for Cuba, and since it was my choice to pick where to assign these ships, I'm getting ahead of myself, excuse me. I assigned the VSOL to a station directly north of Cuba, north of Havana. As long as we were at the theater, I wanted to have a front row seat. The air annex of the operation plan for this contingency specified that the ships assigned to the designated stations should be radar picket destroyers, equipped with a homing device then known as TACAN. Desron 6 met those requirements, and the idea was to establish accurate geographic points of reference which Air Force bomber aircraft could home in on, and thereby more accurately vector in on their assigned targets in Cuba. During an earlier visit to Guantanamo, we had become familiar with recent intelligence reports describing how the Soviets were engaged in improving Cuban air defense capabilities, including radar search equipment and operating personnel. It was obvious to us that our presence in those stations would reveal that we were radar picket destroyers. Our TACAN emissions alone would serve to establish that fact, and that would be a dead giveaway to the conclusion that we were there to support air strikes, so we could expect preemptive attacks to be launched against us if the situation deteriorated. A further bothersome detail of the air annex was the requirement that the picket ships remain within 400 yards of their assigned stations at all times. We were in well over 100 fathoms of water, so well, I better give this paper up and tell you that since we were in over 100 fathoms of water, anchoring was simply not an option. And furthermore, we were in the Florida Straits, which had a current of 3 to 4 knots. So obviously, we were not going to be able to remain within a radius of 400 yards of our assigned positions. So I addressed the message to Commander Second Fleet, and I told him that we were unable to follow the instructions in the Air Annex, and I told him why, and I recommended that instead we be ordered to remain within 4 hours steaming distance of those stations. That recommendation was approved, and we then took our new stations in accordance with this new directive. From that point on, I've lost my train of thought for a minute, excuse me. Well, we went ahead and manned our stations, which were then on a east-west line 20 miles north of the Cuban coast in the vicinity of Havana, with the 4 positions that I had mentioned, one directly north of the city of Havana, and the other one 20 miles to the east, the other 2 20 miles intervals to the west of that. We stayed on those lines and operated as early warning pickets, trying to keep early warning measures in effect in the event that we encountered any unknown or strange surface ship or air contact headed towards the United States. In that case, we were expected to issue early warning and let the communications department know what was going on. Immediately following that, we became engaged in the selection of merchantmen coming into Cuba, and frequently these ships were hailed and queried by one of the 4 ships of Desron 6, asking where they were going and what their destination was and what their cargoes were. And in the course of that activity, the 4 ships of Desron 6 frequently encountered circumstances where they were required to inspect the ships from a distance and make a determination as to whether or not they should be stopped. And we had had a discussion before we got into the mess that we were in, to the effect that we had options available to us in the event that one of these merchant ships would refuse to stop if ordered to do so. And of course, there were a couple of options available. We could man the gun battery and train the gun battery at the target, or we could fire a shot across its bow, or we could fire a shot into its rudder or its screws. And in any case, we knew that we would be able to stop any of these ships if we had to. And furthermore, we decided that we did not need to make a determination as to how exactly we were going to stop them until the time came for action. So we proceeded on that basis. And of course, we didn't come to that point. We did encounter a couple of times when merchantmen approaching Cuba from foreign countries became the subject of suspicion. One of those was a Cuban-bound freighter from Norway. And in that case, the Newman K. Perry, 20 miles to the east of the Viso, encountered that ship, and the Norwegian sent him a message asking that he send a boarding party or a boarding officer to board his ship. Well, the commanding officer of the Newman K. Perry then was a young commander who had had previous duty in Norway as assistant to the naval attaché. And since he had familiarity with the country, he decided he would make the boarding call himself, which he did. And he later described what it was like going over to the Norwegian freighter in his boat from the Newman K. Perry. And he said when he got about halfway to the freighter, he looked up and suddenly saw 2 MiG aircraft diving at his boat. And he then entertained thoughts as to how deep could he dive? And furthermore, how long could he stay under? And before he had to make up his mind about which he would do, the 2 MiGs began circling instead of diving on them. And at that point, he arrived at the merchantman and went aboard and met with the ship's master. They went to the wardroom, where the Norwegian sailors appeared to be very apprehensive about what their reception was going to be when they got to Havana, in light of the fact that they had obviously been surveyed, probably photographed, while being boarded by a U.S. Navy boarding officer. The skipper of the Newman K. Perry told them that he thought they could counter that problem by simply saying that the whole episode was due to misunderstanding of signals, and they adopted that as their explanation. Anyway, there was no further complication from that, but in the course of the visit, the master of the ship voluntarily provided some valuable intelligence items to the skipper of the Perry, including several rolls of undeveloped film and a sample of his cargo. These were sent to Washington, and the Director of Naval Intelligence issued a Bravo Zulu, or well done, to the skipper of the Newman K. Perry for having obtained that intelligence. Now, at this point, from the standpoint of the total blockade, news came that the Soviets had decided to remove their missiles. That seemed to us to end the crisis, but it did not solve the problem of how they were going to go about the removal. So negotiations about that took about 10 days. And during that time, the 4 ships of Desron 6 continued on their early warning mission, patrolling the straits and looking for intruders. Finally, word reached us that the problem had been solved. They had determined that the way to remove the missiles was to take them out on merchant ships and allow U.S. destroyers to intercept these ships and do a visual inspection from close alongside, similar to the manner in which we would have gone alongside a fueling ship during fueling at sea exercises. And we were certain that this would give us the opportunity to view and count the missiles because they were being carried on the weather decks of the ships, and they would be in plain sight. So we happened to be in Key West on about the 8th of November, having been in there to fuel every 3rd or 4th day. and I was sent for by Admiral McElroy, who was then Commander Key West Force, who was our operational control commander. He said that when I got up there that he had a job for me. And I welcomed the news that he had a job, and he proceeded to explain to me that we had been notified that we could conduct these inspections, and that he was going to assign the VSOL to be the first of the destroyers to make an inspection of the outgoing missiles. And that he had chosen the VSOL because he wanted to have a unit commander on the scene in the event that anything untoward occurred. So, having outlined the basic ground rules, he told me that he wanted us to do the first inspection of the first two Soviet merchantmen the next day, the next morning. And that ship was to be the Vogalis. Well, it appeared to me that if we were going to overtake the Vogalis, which was already about 100 miles ahead of us because it had left Havana that morning, we were going to have to get moving. So I indicated to Admiral McElroy that it was time for us to go, and he said, "Fine, I agree. Is there any last-minute request that you have?" And I said, "Yes, Admiral, I think it would be nice if we could have a foreign Russian language expert go along with us." And to my pleasant surprise, he said, "Oh, no problem. We'll have him aboard before you sail." So I went back to the VSOL, explained the mission to the captain of the ship. It was obviously a single ship operation. I would be an interested observer, available for advice or counsel if any question arose. He would be in complete charge of his ship, and it was time for us to get moving. So we got underway a few minutes later and proceeded to sea, and we overtook the Vogalis late that evening. We followed him astern, about a mile behind him. And in the morning, shortly before daylight, the VSOL was alongside of the Vogalis, no more than 25 yards away from him. And we looked over it to see what was going on aboard the Russian ship, and saw that the master was standing up on on the flying bridge, looking very unhappy. And I was observing him through 7 by 50 binoculars, so I could clearly see his facial expression. And I noticed that when the commanding officer of the VSOL called over, in English of course, that he wanted to inspect their missiles, the Soviet skipper simply looked angry and made no move to do anything. We were well within easy voice range of the ship, and so at that point I called over to our embarked Russian language expert and told him to pick up the bullhorn and go out to the starboard wing of the bridge and to call over to the Polzanov in Russian and say, "Good morning, Captain. We have come to inspect your missiles," in Russian. So he went over to the starboard wing of the bridge and called over and gave that message to the captain. I was watching him, of course, and immediately his expression changed from one of anger to one of delight. And he called back in English, "Good morning. I am ready to have my missiles inspected." And with that, there was no further problem. We called over then and asked him to uncover the missiles because they were covered with canvas tarps. And this was no easy task for him to undertake because we were making 16 knots and there was a northeasterly trade wind of about that same velocity blowing, and we were headed right into it. So that was a lot of work to handle that much flapping canvas in that wind. But the crew of the Polzanov seemed to go about their business with a pleasant attitude, and after struggling with the canvas for about 30 minutes, they uncovered 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. We counted them, of course, and that was our first task completed. We thanked the Russian captain, wished him well, wished him a safe trip home, and headed for our second inspection, which was to be the now I've forgotten the name of the second Soviet ship. It doesn't really matter. We encountered him the following morning, and we were alongside before daybreak. And before we had even exchanged greetings with him, we received a message from Commander Key West Force directing that we not go alongside until further orders. And I responded that we were alongside at that moment. So we received a message which said, break off and follow astern, a mile astern, until further orders. So we had no idea what that was about. We shoved off from alongside, went back to a position a mile astern, with the Soviet captain in the meantime sending us messages via flashing light. Where are you going? I am ready for inspection. And we replied that we had received orders not to carry on the inspection until we were further directed. So we continued on that way for some time until finally we had a sort of updating message from Commander Key West Force telling us that the reason we had been asked to delay the inspection was because the, quote, powers that be, unquote, had decided that it would be appropriate to photograph the inspection and that we were to await the arrival of a plane that would be loaded with news reporters and would take pictures of the inspection. My reaction to that would hardly have been appropriate for publication. And we sort of marked time, a mile astern, awaiting further orders. And shortly thereafter, we received a message giving us the radio frequency with which we could contact the aircraft. And about that time, the plane arrived in sight and communicated with us, told us that they were ready to go ahead with the inspection, which we carried out. We went alongside, counted the missiles. This time there were 7, and there was no problem whatsoever. So we had accounted for a total of 12 now of the outgoing missiles. I think the total of the outgoing missiles came to somewhere in the 40, 42, 44 count. So with that, we broke off and were immediately besieged with questions from the reporters in the aircraft who wanted to know, how did we know that what we had been inspecting were missiles? And I said, well, in the first place, they're 75 feet long and 10 feet in diameter, so they look like missiles. And if it looked like a duck, walked like a duck, quacked like a duck, etc., it appeared to us that these were missiles, and that's what we were convinced they were. I said, furthermore, the skipper of the VSOL is a missile expert, and he thinks they're missiles. And furthermore, if we went aboard the Soviet ship and took the faceplates off the missiles and peered inside, we still wouldn't know whether the machinery we were looking at was the machinery of a missile. So, to all extents and purposes, we had determined to our satisfaction that they were missiles. That seemed to satisfy everybody finally. And with that, they departed, and the VSOL went back into port. We stayed for another couple of days. The VSOL and Newman K. Perry, by the way, had been air controllers for all of the air reconnaissance flights over Cuba throughout the period of the quarantine. And at that point, the Perry just returned to Charleston. So that ended the participation of Desron 6 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the skipper of the Newman K. Perry was commended by the fleet commander for his handling of the boarding incident. And I was proud of having had command of the Desron ships that were involved. I apologize for my mess up of the papers. The pages got mixed up, and I couldn't relate them in my head. At the age of 98, I think this may be my last appearance. I'm to be followed by former Chief John O'Malley.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to try to portray is the enlisted, very junior enlisted version of what happened. Officially, the Cuban crisis was announced on the 22nd of October, 1962. The Kennedy was underway at that point when the president made his announcement that he's going to be setting up the quarantine. But for us, it really started in the previous month at the Newport yacht races. The Kennedy, President Kennedy came aboard the ship to observe for 2 days. And on the last day, he was presented with a model of the Kennedy, which is named after his brother. And he gave us a copy of his most recent book. And then he also made an announcement that whatever happens, the Kennedy will be in the forefront of any action during my administration. So we get underway and we heard his speech and we just says, oh boy, you know, enlisted people, that means duration in 6 months. And I was, again, a young seaman apprentice, and I said, what do you mean duration in 6 months? Whatever happens, until it's over, then you get 6 months to go before they'll discharge you. So we get underway, and we went on station. As I said, at the time I was a seaman's apprentice, I wasn't privy to all the messaging going back and forth. And one night, apparently we got orders to join the piers to board the Markula, a Liberian freighter that was leased by the Soviets. So we turned south at flank speed overnight until we arrived at daybreak. Of course, this made the Pierce real happy that they had to wait for the Kennedy to get there before they could do anything. And then they called general quarters that morning about 4:30, and they and made the typical, this is a drill, this general quarters, all hand man your battle stations. And the boatswain ended it with, "This is not a drill." And of course, at that point, everybody woke up, started moving, and once the stations were manned, being a brand new radarman at the time, I had no idea what was going on in combat. So the leading petty officer handed me a set of sound-powered phones. On the Kennedy, we had a door that led to a bridge wing just below the bridge deck. And he said, "Plug into the JV circuit and let us know what's going on." So I had a front row view of the boarding, the inspection, and the return. And apparently they timed it so that the two ships, small boats, came alongside the Markula at the same time on opposite sides. Once the Markula was released and started heading into Cuba, the sonar, I was back in combat at the time, and sonar announced a contact. And he says, "Oh my God." And they said, "What?" "There's 4 of them, and they're in a perfect diamond formation, which means there's 1 forward, 2 this way, and 1 aft." And we said, they just popped up above the layer just to let us know they were there. I'm sure you surface guys know what that means. Anyway, the one sub had an apparent engine problem and came to the surface. Now, a little footnote in history, the book Black October, I can't remember the author's name right now, described the Cuban crisis from both points of view. And all 4 submarines had 1 atomic or nuclear tipped torpedo. And they had orders to fire if one of our ships tried to bring any Soviet ship into the American port. That's how close we came. By stopping the Markula, which they sent ahead as a decoy, we proved that we will stop the ships, but being just dry goods and truck parts, we had no reason to confiscate it and bring it into port. So we just let her go. At that point, within a few days, by then the official crisis was over, the 28th of October. We went south again, met up with the fleet Marines that the captain referred to, coming back from the Med, and got into a gunfire support position while we steamed back and forth through the southern coast of Cuba, anticipation of an invasion. Of course, that was negotiated away, thank goodness. And then we went out and did the springboard routine for the remainder of the time, spent Thanksgiving at sea, then returned to Newport on the 7th of December, 1962. Thank you very much.
Good job, George.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was really great. That concludes our program for the evening. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good evening, drive safe, get home, and enjoy tomorrow. Good night.